A blast of steam hit the old man and fogged his goggles. Oliver leaned back in his seat and wiped away the condensation with the back of his glove. He scowled at the misbehaving mass of pipes, valves and cogs that had just blasted him like it was a naughty child. He ran a hand through his snow-white hair and wiped his mouth with his sleeve before returning to his original task of tightening the valves. The rhythmic clanking of brass on stone and the clattering of cogs drew his attention to the path behind him. Oliver looked over his shoulder to see his grandfather on his morning stroll. It had been several decades since Oliver's grandfather made the executive decision to have his soul transferred. Even though he could no longer feel the breeze against his metallic skin, he still found enjoyment in walking through the farm every now and then. Oliver couldn't understand it, though. Sure, one may call it immortality. But was it really? He thought having a machine for a body just took away all the wonders of living, the ability to feel, to taste, or smell. Not to mention he'd have to see a mechanic when something broke down. When his time came, he'd walk with death in acceptance. "How are things?" Oliver's grandfather stopped next to him to see what he was up to. Oliver coughed and tapped the machine with his wrench. "This old pump's acting up again," he grunted. "It might be high time we get it replaced." Grandfather glanced at the tank at the end of the machine, his eyes illuminating the viscous orange fluid inside. "A shame," he said slowly. "These old pumps were hard workers once." "Well, everything grows old and comes to an end." Oliver got up and brushed himself off. He retrieved his toolbox and glanced at the tree the machine was attached to. Sparks of orange magic fluttered around the canopy of the ancient tree. With the abundance of these trees all across the farm, these sparks were almost everywhere. A little annoying, but worth the profit in the end. This was a farm that extracted and refined magic from these old trees. Specially designed pumps would pull the enigmatic substance from them without harming them too much. But they needed so much attention. Oliver spent most of the day checking the pumps and making sure none of them broke down. He'd been seeing advertisements in the local newspaper about a new line of pumps that didn't need so much maintenance. To him it sounded like a godsend, but dear Lord, the price tag. Maybe he could afford them when the old pumps finally gave up for good. Oliver walked alongside his metallic grandfather on his way to the next pump. "It's the way things are, Pops." "Yes, but it doesn't have to be." Grandfather raised a hand to gesture to himself. "I should have been dead for 50 years now and I'm still walking." "In a machine you are." Oliver stared forward. A cold, unfeeling machine. Grandfather didn't respond immediately. "Maybe so, but at least I can still see and hear the beauty the world has to offer. You have to get tired of it at some point." "I know. And when I do, I'll be satisfied." Hours passed, and Oliver finally finished maintenance on the last pump. He looked up at the orange sky and sighed. Another day passed, one more day gone, one step closer. "No, don't think about that now." He twiddled the small brass tube which dangled on a chain around his neck and marched along the path, his toolbox in hand, his goggles on his forehead, and his heart in the past. Oliver glanced to his side and imagined the echo of his daughter's glowing smile beaming up at him. A tear ran down his cheek and into his beard as he remembered the last time he said goodbye to her. She was much too young. He closed the front door behind him and walked to the kitchen to grab something to eat. His grandfather was already there, preparing dinner. What he did find puzzling was the second plate he had set on the table. Pops?" Oliver's brow wrinkled. "Yes, Oliver. You do remember you can't eat, right?" "Yes. Why?" "Because you set 2 plates on the table." Grandfather turned around to look. "No, I didn't," he said. Oliver pointed to the plate on the end of the table opposite his own. Grandfather walked over to inspect it. "I may be an old soul, but I'm not senile. I know I didn't put this here." Well, I just arrived, so I didn't put it there. They both looked at the plate in confusion. Grandfather took the plate and carried it away to the kitchen. Maybe the past is creeping up on our minds, and we're not seeing it. Are you suggesting one of us put it there unwittingly for Grace? Grandfather shrugged. I've heard tales of such things happening. It's a way some people remember a lost loved one. Oliver glanced at the spot where the plate had sat. He sucked in a breath and nodded. Yeah, he muttered. That must be it. Dinner was nothing extravagant, just a simple meal to get by on. As Oliver got up to put his plate away, he thought he saw something shimmer past a doorway in the corner of his eye. He looked that way, but nothing was there. Great, he thought to himself. I'm finally losing my mind. He washed his plate, put it in the dryer rack, and stepped out to find his favorite chair in the study. As he neared the study door, he heard the faint sound of mechanical commotion. Figuring his grandfather was in there reading, he opened the door and greeted him. Grandfather wasn't there. The sound of a small cogwheel spinning on wood drew Oliver's attention to a desk in the corner of the room. The lights around it were on, and there were cogs and springs scattered across the surface. Oliver knew he had cleaned it off that morning. Something thumped as it landed on the floor behind the desk. Oliver strode over to investigate, only to find a toppled-over box and a thin dusting of magic sparks on the floor. He raised a brow. The box, he could understand being there, but the sparks. He crouched down and found a few more cogs strewn about. Whatever was there was doing something with them. Oliver lifted himself back up to inspect the desk. Mixed into the mess of loose parts, he spotted a contraption he didn't recognize. He inspected the device from every angle. Whatever it was, it didn't work. He found a key and twisted it, only for nothing to happen. The device didn't even have a spring to wind up. In fact, it was missing parts everywhere, and the parts that were there looked like whoever was making this thing had been trying to force in parts that didn't fit. Then Oliver noticed the size of the parts. They were all too small for his hands to handle. This handiwork was much too delicate for him to pull off without breaking something, and Grandfather's clumsy metal hands probably wouldn't even grip such small gears. So, who was working on this thing? A glass fell to the floor and shattered. Oliver turned around quickly to see the mess it left behind. He looked up at the shelf it fell from and spotted a small anthropomorphic shadow standing at the edge. It scrambled to escape his view as he got up and darted toward it. It tripped over something and fell off the high shelf. Oliver rushed as best he could and caught it in one outstretched hand. He leaned against the shelf to regain his breath before inspecting what he had just caught. His eyes widened as he saw a tiny little girl with wings as orange as copper and sparks of magic twinkling around her. A fairy. She looked up and panicked when she saw where she was. "Whoa there, little one." Oliver tried to speak calmly despite his excitement. "I'm not going to hurt you." Fairies hadn't been seen in the world since the medieval times when they were nearly everywhere. Now Oliver had one sitting in his hand. He walked back to the work desk slowly and steadily. The last thing he wanted to do was risk hurting such a small being. He sat down at the desk and set the fairy gently in front of him. "Have you been making this?" The unfinished device fit on his palm. The fairy sat there, glancing between him and the gizmo. She nodded and shuffled backward on the desk. "I'm impressed by your work," Oliver stated with a light smile. "A bit messy, but I can tell you're making it with some purpose in mind. Although, I can't quite tell what that purpose is." "It's a music box," the fairy said. Her eyes widened as a smile grew on her face. She quickly pulled back and shuffled away again. "You've no need to be scared. I won't hurt you. Rather, I'm glad to have company other than my grandfather." Cautiously, the fairy moved forward. "Your grandfather? But you seem old enough to be one yourself. she asked with a raised brow. It's complicated. He put his soul into a machine to escape death a little longer. Oliver leaned back in his chair. Personally, I don't understand it. Your time came and went. You need to accept these things. The fairy rose to her feet. You don't want him around anymore? No, it's not that. I just don't think the illusion of immortality is worth losing everything that makes life worth living. He glanced at the mechanism still in his hand. So, a music box, you said? The fairy nodded and stepped forward. I'm missing a lot of parts, though. I don't actually own many things for making music boxes. Oliver inspected the box again. And I've noticed, while you have the general idea of what you're making, you don't actually know how. The fairy tilted her head. Oliver started pointing out faults he'd spotted. You have gears with different tooth meshes shoved together. Axles are bending from the wrong-sized gears. And here, you have a perpendicular mesh between gears that are not made to do that. He put the box down. Even if this did work, it wouldn't last long. The fairy's head sank in defeat. The orange shine of her wings seemed to dull. But we can fix that. She raised her head to make eye contact. Oliver pulled out a handkerchief and wiped the lenses of his glasses. I'm impressed you made what you did. How about I help you improve on it? He smiled warmly. I'll even buy the parts so we can finish it. Grandfather knocked on the open door, announcing his arrival. Oliver, what's going on? I heard you talking to someone. His mechanical frame hobbled into the room, leaning on a copper cane. The joint on his right knee had disconnected again and was now swinging loosely, hence the need for the cane. Come over. We have a guest. Oliver waved at the tiny figure on the workbench. Grandfather clanked to the work desk to see the fairy standing there. Is that a... I thought fairies were extinct. Clearly not, and this one has an interest in clockworks. Oliver turned to the fairy. I'm sorry I never got your name, little one. The fairy smiled. Facet. You can call me Facet. That's an odd name. Fairies don't really name their young. We're encouraged to find our names ourselves. I saw the word on your box of tools and liked it. Weeks went by. Oliver and Grandfather had grown accustomed to having Facet living with them. She was a fast learner. Day 1, she didn't know the difference between a gauge 1-2 pipe and a gauge 3-5. But by the end of day 9, she could identify 7 common sizes of pipe connection at a glance. Once she understood the meanings of the gear shapes and sizes, she would work long into the nights to reconstruct her music box properly. Oliver inspected the music box every night after Facet went to sleep. He was impressed with her progress. All the gears turned smoothly when he twisted a single axle. The brass harp, the wheel that played it, and the spring that would get it going were the only 3 parts missing. One night, after putting the box down next to Facet, Oliver coughed so hard his glasses almost fell off. Are you all right? The groggy voice of the no longer snoozing Facet met his ear. Facet slumped on her music box. That didn't sound too good. She yawned. Oliver cleared his throat. Just allergies. I get them this time of the year, he grinned. You should go back to sleep. You need your rest. Facet nodded and walked to the folded-up towel she had been using as a mattress. Oliver left the room and carefully closed the door. As he brushed off his sleeves, he noticed a light spatter of red on the sleeve he had coughed into. His blood ran cold and sweat gathered on his brow. This new symptom could only be an omen for bad things to come. He shook his head, took a deep breath, sighed, and wiped his arm against his brow. He wasn't going to let the others see and panic over this. The following day, Oliver finally finished repairing the pumps on the trees and was able to head into town. He loaded the old truck with a full tank of magic and climbed into the driver's seat. Grandfather came along with him riding shotgun. Facet wanted to come too, but she needed to stay hidden. Since fairies were so rare, there was no telling what might happen if anyone saw her. She still wanted to be able to see what was going on, so Oliver wore a hat that was just the right size for her to hide in. The building where they sold the farmed magic stood at the far end of town. The two large silos along the side wall gleamed in the sunlight, as did the orange magic through the gauge windows. Oliver drove around the back and navigated into the station where the magic would be pumped into a storage tank. The operator stood calculating the amount of magic arriving and how much to appropriately pay. Money in hand, Oliver drove to the market where they could purchase the final parts of Facet's project. The spring and the harp were easy enough to find. However, Facet was disappointed when they couldn't find a music wheel. Oliver couldn't understand it himself. A shop that sells brass harps, but not the wheel to play them? Perhaps, Grandfather commented. This means the music box will have to be more personal. Back at the house, they unloaded the supplies. Just as Oliver put down the last box, he curled over and coughed hard. His hat flew off and landed on the ground. He kept coughing as he stumbled to lean on the wall. Facet emerged from his hat onto the dirt, concern written on her face. "That's not allergies, Oliver. Are you all right?" Oliver coughed more violently, covering his mouth with his hand. When he finally stopped, blood stained his palm. Grandfather and Facet stared at his hand, their eyes growing wide. "What the devil, Oliver?" Grandfather shouted. "You need a doctor now." "I don't need a doctor," Oliver grumbled. "It's nothing, You'll just nothing. Get back in the truck. I'm taking you back to town right now." Grandfather's voice hit hard. The air of authority was almost suffocating. Facet stayed at the house as they returned to the truck and drove away to the local doctor's office. Nightfall. Grandfather returned to the farm without Oliver. He went inside and searched for Facet. As expected, he found her sitting by the music box. She had installed the harp and spring to pass the time. She looked up at him with a tear in her eyes. "Where's Oliver?" she asked, her voice shaking. Grandfather took a seat in front of the desk and laid his brass hands on the surface, weaving his fingers together. "They said it was..." He hesitated. "They said it was serious. He's going to be staying with them for a while. But, given his age, Facet looked up into the light of his eyes. Tears poured from her own. He might not make it. Facet fell to her knees and laid her head atop Grandfather's joined hands. "It's not fair," she muttered. "Why does life have to be so cruel?" Her wings perked up as she looked up at Grandfather again. "His soul, could it be put into a machine like you did?" Grandfather shook his head. "He's expressed that he hates that idea. When the world says it's time to go, he wants to go." Facet broke down weeping. "I don't want to say goodbye either. That's one reason I did this." He gestured to himself. "I didn't want my family to go through the pain of losing me, so I stayed. Now Oliver's the last one of us." "And what about you? Is that when you move on? Are you going to die when there's no one left to say goodbye to?" Grandfather slipped his hands under Facet and raised her to his face. "Oliver is my last living relative, but you are part of the family too," he said warmly. "As long as I have family, I'm not leaving, because to me, that is what makes life worth living." Grandfather went to visit Oliver the following day. His elderly grandson looked like he'd been through hell and back. The machinery around his bed was only barely keeping him alive. Oliver turned his head and greeted him. "Nice to see you, you old bag of bolts," he joked. Facet popped up from a bag Grandfather held. "And you too, Facet." Facet fluttered to the table next to Oliver with tears in her eyes. He gripped a picture tightly in his hands. "Who's that?" She pointed to a young girl in the picture. Oliver held it up so she could see. "That's my daughter, Grace. She died when she was only 7. His voice slowed as he thought back over the years. It was the same thing I have now. Oddly poetic, he chuckled. The thing that tore us apart is going to bring us back together. Grandfather extracted the music box from the bag and placed it next to Facette. Oliver looked it over from where he lay. "You've nearly finished it," he smiled. "Yes," Facette confirmed, "but it still needs a drum." About that, Oliver reached under his shirt and extracted the metal tube on his necklace. He removed it from the chain and handed it to Facette. The tube had grooves running around the circumference with a pattern of protrusions dotted between each careful line. Grace had a music box that she'd always play to lull her to sleep. That wheel played her favorite song when she closed her eyes for the last time, and it's been with me since. He laid back in the bed. "I hope it fits," he smiled. Facette jumped off the table and hugged his arm tightly. They both attended Oliver's funeral, grandfather keeping Facette hidden under a hat. Not many people showed up as they had few living relatives. When they returned to the farm, Facette installed Grace's music drum and turned the box's key to hear its song. The magically wondrous ringing of a beautiful childhood lullaby remained the only sound in the house until the spring ran down.